Today we're going to talk Targa. I'm going to cover the Targa model iteration effectively across the Equal series, very briefly dive into that. We're going to take a drive in a Targa, we're going to talk about the respective merits of a Targa, some contentious points around values. And because we're in the fortunate position where we have two of these coming off the line, we're going to be able to dive into some of the detail that we kind of focus in on when we build Targas, and also talk about the distinction between, in this case, two models, which is on the left a 77 911 2.7 effectively, and on the right a 79 911 SC 3 litre. We'll talk about those details a little bit later. So we're going to then certainly take a drive in both cars and talk about the different performance upgrades to them, some of the aesthetic treatments that we've done to them, and so on. But without any further ado, let's dive straight into some history trivia. I won't spend too long on this. The Targa was developed in 1967, pretty much preemptively, or by Porsche to preempt a concern that they had that the US market, from a regulatory point of view, was going to outlaw cabriolets from a rollover safety point of view. So they preemptively developed this very distinctive bar that would effectively serve from a rollover protection point of view. And they in fact launched this car as a safety cabriolet back in 67, known now as the soft window, where the entire soft window would zip out as with the top. And you can then see the roots of this, which is effectively a cabriolet with a a safety bar. The other benefit of that safety bar is that it would also assist with torsional rigidity to stop the car from flexing back to front across the body, which has a certain impact on drivability. We'll touch on that during the drives. But out came the safety cabriolet. And well, we'll get to that a little later. The legislation in fact did not come in, and they did not end up needing to discontinue cabriolets. And the Targa itself ended up becoming highly successful. Interesting little, let's call it milestones, from 67 through to 69, the soft window. And then in 69 in came this very distinctive, now very recognizable, iconic, patented in fact, and unique to Porsche, that rear fixed window, that panoramic rear fixed window, which remained in place all the way through, from 69 all the way through to the end of the 964, and only by the 993 coming in, now we're into the 90s, did it get replaced by a glass roof. But over the course of the 993 into the 996, and then in fact into the 997, it then got replaced again, back with this very iconic hoop or loop, at vast expense from an engineering point of view. So definitely let's call it a very successful innovation by Porsche. So, and here's another interesting fact, is they thought that it was going to ultimately replace the cabriolet. So back in 1983, out comes this guy, the 1983 SC Cabriolet, which, as you can see here, no rollover hoop. They'd finally developed the tech to allow for structural torsional rigidity in the car, safety from a rollover point of view, or sufficiently safe from a legislation point of view. And out came the cabriolet. And I'm going to say this straight up. I love the cabriolet. It's got such a Bobby Ewing Dallas feel to it. And if anybody understands what that means, or that reference, you'll understand what I mean. But there's just something so absolutely, I don't know, 80s about these cars. And a little secret, don't tell anyone, but these to me are the last remaining pocket of true value within the air-cooled range that people have yet to fully discover. But let's not cover the cabriolet in too much more detail. What we're talking about is the fact that the Targas came in, were designed effectively because they thought the cabriolets would be outlawed. The cabriolets, however, continued, and so did the Targa. But therein lies a very interesting realization, which is not only did Porsche set out to solve a potential problem, they did so well that they developed an entirely unique model series, unique to Porsche, this third iteration, not a cabriolet, not a coupe, a Targa, that to this day still endures. And in certain markets, over the course that they were introduced, outsold the coupe. Now, let's just take a drive. Stop me waffling. Well, I'll waffle in a different place. Let's do that. I'll take a drive in, let's take our first drive in the 77, talk generally about the feel of these cars, and then let's maybe come back and talk about value. All right, the timing seems to have worked out quite well. I'm going to take a drive in the 77 car. Leisurely drive. I'm just going to try and explain to you what it's like to drive a Targa. And obviously one of the benefits being, here we are on a kind of an early summer's evening in South Africa. The skies are looking quite angry, so there might be a bit of rain later, but we've got a beautiful sunset happening over there, and we're in the open. So here is this amazing kind of, let's call it feature or factor, and I've got both windows open, wide open, about this Targa, is that, and you can probably feel it or you can hear it. You can hear me perfectly as you would if you were a passenger. I'm driving not at a high speed, 30-40 kilometers an hour at the moment, and yet I'm totally insulated. Let's close this window just as one example, and we can close this one too to give you an idea. But here we go. The hair that I have left is barely rustling in the wind, as against a cabriolet which tends to have a little bit of, let's call it blowback. In other words, a whole lot of wind that comes in from the rear on a cabriolet. That's totally mitigated by way of the panoramic glass at the rear. What you can't see from that angle is just how open and unobstructed the rear view is. So through the rear view mirror, there is nothing other than glass, because there's no side structural components to the rear window. You know, roller coaster vibes. It's absolutely lovely. So there's a, and it's a little difficult to explain versus experience, but there's something about what a Targa gives you that is hard to describe. So it is, you are open, but you do not feel particularly exposed. And I guess that's based on a few things. One is you're conscious of the fact that there's something protecting you, but I think it's just the perception and the feel that you get. The cabin as well, from an acoustic point of view, feels insulated. And this is a remarkable thing, which I've done on a few occasions, and works extremely well in even the most severe of climates. But you can be in midwinter, let's close here just for the sake of it. You can be in midwinter, close the two windows, take off the roof, crank up the heater, which in these air-cooled cars is unusually efficient and effective. And it is warm in here. So it's truly quite remarkable in the flexibility that it provides. And I don't want to sound like I'm gushing too much for Targas, because the cabriolets in their own right are also extremely, I don't know what the word is, unique, especially the 911s. There's a look to them, especially with their roofs off, which I find extremely alluring. As I mentioned, I think they're somewhat undervalued, and I would snap one up if I was you. And also the coupes have got a wonderful look to them. They are certainly, without question, absolutely iconic. I'm not trying to say that this is better than them. I'm saying that it has something to offer that neither of them do, which is this wonderful middle ground that you have. Right, let's talk values. This is going to get a few hairs raised. Now here's an interesting thing. The Targas at retail, in other words, when they were launched, and to this day, carry a premium. They are more expensive than the coupes. They are more expensive to manufacture. There are more components to them, and they carry at retail, at new, a premium price, and that's what they sell at. All of these cars, when they first hit the showroom floor, were more expensive than their coupe counterparts. Roughly 10%, and that there are certain market exceptions, but roughly 10 to 15% more expensive. Yet today, on average, if one looks at the auction market, the Targas traded roughly or between 5 to 25% at a discount to their coupe counterparts. Now, what is interesting about that is that the earlier Targas, in other words, the 1970s broadly, traded only roughly a 5% discount to the coupes, whereas the later models in the G series at least come up to the kind of, like, for example, an 89 G50 coupe will be roughly 20 to 25% more expensive than a Targa. So there's an interesting pattern here which I'd like to point out, which is the older the Targa, in other words, the longer the Targa has been in the market, the more of a parity it gets to its coupe counterpart. Now, why is that? And my view is that it's got to do with what I would call relative, or the relative importance of performance. As a car gets older, more desirable, more collectible, due to a broadening number of, let's call it, value propositions that car has got to offer. Because of the fact that the Targa carries more structural reinforcement to stop that torsional flex. It is slightly heavier. That heaviness translates into well, in the tenths of a second of performance 0 to 60 miles an hour. So it is on paper slower than its coupe counterpart. Also, due to the torsional rigidity, which is still sacrificed somewhat, it has improved significantly with that Targa hoop, but there still is a little bit of flex. It arguably has less of a turn in. So what you've got is a market that focuses in, I think, disproportionately still on the concept of performance of a car that's approaching 50 years old. Now, performance, it is important in as much as it needs to have sufficient performance and be thrilling to drive, but it is only a small portion of the value proposition of what this car has to offer. These Targas are 20 to 40 kilograms heavier than their coupe counterparts, a tenth of a second slower 0 to 60, and with the right setup, primarily drive exactly the same as their coupes. No longer is that, in my opinion, of any material consequence in terms of the performance of these cars. But the perception within the market, given the positioning of the Porsche brand being a performance car, has led to the coupes, almost as a side effect of that thinking, being seen as the preferred car. But my argument against that is the Targas are effectively two cars in one. They offer a dual value proposition. There is a larger market that broadly like them, which adds to their charm factor. I believe they've got a higher, and this is from personal experience, a higher likability quotient from the average person. It's very easy to fall in love with what a Targa looks like, and that stands for something. And that's why I believe that the vehicles which are older, in the 70s for example, are starting to, or have fundamentally caught up with their coupe counterparts, and that trend will continue. So every year, in relative terms, the Targa's value is increasing at a faster rate than the coupe. Both of them are increasing, but the Targas are moving faster. So it does not mean they're better. I'm saying it has an appeal based on its let's call it use and practicality and so forth. They are undervalued, and that will flatten out. They are at a parity, in my opinion, to the coupes. So that's the argument around value. But let's now just focus in on these respective two cars. Let's take one for a drive, shall we? Let's go out in this one, do a bit of a whip around in it, and talk about that car. Okay, we're going to take a drive in the 79 SC, 3-litre motor. Definitely have taken the compression of this car right up. So it's she would have started out at 8.6 back in 78, 79 as she left the factory floor. We've taken that up to the lower 11s. That compression is effectively just how much we compress the air inside of the cylinder by way of have an increased dome on the piston. That pressure translates into power. There are limitations. You can't just keep pushing the curve on compression. Things get very hot. You get the risk of pre-ignition. So it's a delicate balance that you have to run. But in this car, we've kind of paired that high compression with a 964 camshaft, a little bit more aggressive, tiny bit. And then we've got a lot more air running through her. We're in the fortunate position in this country where we can run fairly high quality fuel, so 95 octane or RON. Means that we can push our compression slightly higher than in some countries. We always get the balance right for the clients that we're building cars for. But long story short, this car has certainly got a lot more power than the day that she left the factory floor. She also sounds different, so let's kind of give an idea of that. She's got a performance header on her, which is what carries the air out of the motor before we hit the exhaust. Header design is, and this was a surprise to me just how important it is actually quite critical, which is as the air leaves these respective ports, 6 of them in this case, and flows into the exhaust, there is kind of ways in which air travels where it can create vacuum. And without getting into too much detail there, I vividly recall one of our kind of workshop technicians, we were trying to kind of work out a problem on a car, and he blew into one port, and instead of the air coming out of another, it in fact created a vacuum and a suction. So don't underestimate the importance of header design. If you're asleep by now, I understand. Let's take a drive. Okay, so she's definitely a lot louder, mostly or primarily due to the amount of air running through the exhaust. She's also got a twin outlet, so there's a lot more air running through. So lots of air coming through, nice bit of high compression. We've balanced it out very nicely. She still runs her standard Bosch injection CIS system. In fact, let's do this. Notice the luxuries of electric windows. The electric window, we talk about luxuries. If you now drive a modern car, the luxury list is never ending. The things that new cars do for you is astounding, and in fact it gets to the point for me, maybe it's just me showing my age, but they become almost convoluted in all the things they try and do for you. There's a certain, let's call it appeal of stock standard. Here is your window winder, or electric winder in this case, and this is where the radio is, and this is where you turn on the air. But still, let's not get into that. I've got the hood on, and quite interestingly enough, we literally just had a rainstorm come through here a couple of minutes ago. It's dried off now, and for dramatic effect, I'm just basically pointing out another kind of key advantage of a Targa, which is it rains, you put the roof on, and you drive in the rain. It is fully waterproof. A little anecdote for those that may not know, but there's this kind of, I don't know, reputation in the industry, that's a strong word, this reputation from many of the uninformed, that's also a bit strong. There is the reputation that Targas have that they sometimes leak, and that there's quite a bit of wind noise. Now, I'm going to counter that firstly and just say the only reason you would have a leaking roof is because it wasn't fitted properly. And here's the anecdote, which is Porsche themselves, when they built these cars in the factory, each and every Targa roof was manually adjusted individually to fit. So you've got very, large degrees of, well, you've got a large space that runs between, kind of basically the windscreen and the cowl, or the hoop at the back. Any movement there or anything that's kind of shifted slightly in manufacturing leads to a gap. So each and every hood would be adjusted. So obviously roll that forward. If you're going to restore a car, you're going to have to manually and personally adjust each and every hood, and then it will not leak. In terms of wind noise, like, what is wind noise? These cars make a wind noise because they cut through the wind. Their side view mirrors make wind noise. So I don't really kind of worry too much about wind noise as a concept because it's part and parcel of what these cars are. But no, Targas don't, as a rule, make more noise. They can make a little bit more. There's a little bit of a fold on the top of the roof that might capture a bit of air. It's a little bit more difficult to close each and every gap that sits here on the windows themselves. But as a whole, it certainly isn't in any way a concern that they are noisy. There's going to be kind of wind everywhere. So let's get going, shall we? We're now sitting at 4,000 revs. Let's give the traffic a bit of a push. So we're now doing 130 kilometers an hour, 140 kilometers an hour, and that was absolutely effortless. I'll talk about the dynamics of how this motor behaves in a second, but let's just talk about speed broadly and this concept of trying to get a car to simply outright perform and that be the only target. It's not particularly hard to get a car to go particularly fast. You basically just turn certain variables up and you will get a car to go faster. It won't necessarily be reliable, and it certainly won't necessarily be very safe. So anything requires balance when it comes down to it. So simply seeing speed or pure performance as the only objective when building a car is extremely narrow-minded. It certainly isn't narrow-minded if you're building a race car, because the ultimate objective is to simply get around that circuit or up that hill faster than anyone else. And it only needs to last for as long as that race might last for. But when it comes to cars that we drive around in, performance is really only one factor of the benefit curve that it gives, or that it has to offer. So, and I'll make this point a little bit later, classic cars have a very broad and a much larger or wider value curve to offer, but performance isn't all of it. So whilst we're sitting here and I'm talking at length about additional sets of horsepower and more torque, it is all within the context of a number of things that you can get out of these earlier cars, and it certainly isn't the be-all and end-all of anything. But let's get back to this one. Okay, so she certainly has enough power, but what does it translate to in terms of drive? And here, let me stop in fact, so we can do this from a standstill. The rain is going on and off here, so let's not be too silly.
when you put a lot more power through a motor, you've also got the ability to some extent to move that power curve around. You want more torque in the lower revs, which is kind of influenced by your cam design. You want more power at the higher revs. Ideally, what you want is maximum torque at the point that you've changed gear and maximum power at the point that you change out of that gear into another gear. In my opinion, the speed or the kind of the performance of a car is more influenced by the torque that you get, the drive or the grunt that you get out of the car at low revs, rather than when you're screaming along at whatever the red line is. In this case, it's just under 7,000 revs. So I tend to kind of favor cars, or we tend to build cars where torque is where we kind of really push the feel of the car, and that's also a game. It's a dance. If you go with higher compression pistons, and you want to get the most out of them with a more aggressive cam, what inevitably happens is that kind of power curve and that maximum torque gets pushed further and further up the rev curve. So there really is, and this is maybe a better way for me to put my kind of point across, there is also a massive benefit in a car that doesn't have an aggressive cam and doesn't have maximum power, because at lower revs she may well be quite fun to drive, and from 0 to, let's say, 30 miles an hour, she's actually a lot more fun to drive than a far higher performance car from 0 to 60 miles an hour, as an example. It's all about balance, and frankly, even the same motor built in exactly the same way in a similar car, even it might feel different. So where does this one sit? She's got a little power curve that kicks in at around 4,500-5,000 revs, which is where kind of the cam design is kind of perfectly overlapping to produce maximum power, after which it starts to drop down. But her torque comes in nice and early. So let's give her a push. Slide uphill here. Let's go. Oh, I mean, it's not like my head is snapping back. We're not in a GT2, but what we are finding is that this car is effortlessly at 120 kilometers an hour. She's just there. It didn't take us very long to get there. And I can drive, frankly, as fast as any fine that I'm prepared to pay. If driven aggressively, this car will outdrive, I would say, practically any contemporary car that's of even reasonable performance. It won't outdrive a high-performance modern car, or necessarily even a high-performance classic car. But what it'll give you is the ability to practically do any speed you want within the parameters of what the law will allow. Now, let's talk about stiffness, rigidity. There's this concept, or this reality, that the Targas are not as stiff as the coupes. They're not. But this is degrees of stiffness. And understand that stiffness, perceived from the driving point of view, is influenced by many things. It's influenced by the seat that you're in. It certainly is influenced by the setup of the car, which is effectively the corner weighting, which is how the car is carried in terms of how much weight is carried on each wheel, how stiff the suspension is, which is also a factor of that corner weighting. And without getting too complex, I can set up a car that's got massive flexibility in a chassis that'll feel bone stiff. So the feel of the car is not in any way loose and flappy. It really isn't. And I can say that confidently. She isn't loose and flappy. None of them are. Even the cabriolets, which are theoretically have the least torsional rigidity, aren't loose. It is degrees of looseness. So what we get with this car is a little bit more reinforcing, as we've mentioned. She feels absolutely kind of tight to me, at least. What we've got with this car, you may notice from a visual comparison between the 77 and the 79, she's also on 16-inch wheels, but the fronts are 6Js. She carries a slightly different tire profile, and we've dropped her nose slightly, so she has a slightly more aggressive stance, which also stiffens up the suspension. That stiffening up also assists in how she behaves and how she turns in. So effectively, and without me trying to wrap this car around a tree in pursuit of proving a point, this Targa drives as tightly, to my mind, as frankly any coupe that we've built. And I would say that if I wanted to, or if we really wanted to, make the car perform from a more performance point of view more effectively than a coupe, it wouldn't be any trouble at all. It would, however, come with a certain degree of comfort. The ride would get a lot harder. So if I just wanted to dispel two things at the moment. One is we're sitting in a car It's raining. Look, it's not leaking. There's no wind noise to the point that I can't hear, you can't hear me, and I don't know, if there was a passenger in the car, we couldn't hear each other. There certainly is a little, I don't know, bit of noise coming past that side view mirror. Is this rattling? It is not. Will it one day rattle? It might, but it certainly makes a sound telling you that it's here. Is it in any way distracting or some form of, I don't know, loss that you're experiencing? Not at all. So there is nothing to be lost from having that roof. All there is something to be gained by the fact that I can remove this roof, should I wish. And in terms of drivability, sorry, I keep changing. That's, by the way, just a little message about any 911, at least with the 915 box, slamming her into first. Slamming her into first isn't a good idea unless you've come pretty much to a standstill.
Okay, let's talk about our approach to Targas just from an aesthetic point of view. Interestingly enough, and I don't know exactly how your eye responds to these, but I would say that the later model here, which is the 79 SC, almost appears slightly older and more classic than, in fact, over there, the older model, which is the 77. And a lot of that has got to do with paint. So we, in other videos, talk a lot about paint and our selection of paint. This car specifically, we've chosen a kind of a metallic. This is in fact a Porsche color. This is a Porsche metallic olive, which is also period specific. And I specifically chose that color, one, because the client and I spent quite a bit of time iteratively kind of narrowing down what would work, both in terms of what that client wanted out in Michigan, as well as what I believed would work really well with the car. And we opted for a beautiful rich metallic olive, which in fact is a color very much favored by the Porsche family, and seems to, in valuation terms, green seems to often outstrip other colors. But over here what we've got is a slightly different approach, and this is a bespoke color which we've mixed specifically for this car. It's what we call a flat color or a non-metallic color. It's difficult to represent accurately on a digital device. There's a little bit of green in that car which you can't quite pick up, but it's definitely quite distinctive in terms of its finish to the metallic car. And I in no way want to say which one I find to be my favorite, but it is very interesting how it is that color is able to play certain, let's call it, have certain impacts on how you perceive a car broadly. The other thing that I'm going to point out, and we've taken a little bit more creative license with the car on the right versus the left, and only small amounts, is that the retention of the bright trim on a Targa is something which we tend to do. So if there's one thing that I really quite love about a Targa, is that we've got so many more textures in terms of roof texture and, you know, the metallic hoops or bars, as well as chrome, as well as rubber, as well as, you know, plastic. We've got all these textures which we can play with, more so than what we have on the cabriolet, on the coupes, and it allows us kind of a rich palette in which we can create something quite unique and distinctive without kind of breaking too many rules. But there is one thing which we do, not as a rule, but we tend to, which is we will retain bright trim on Targas. And to be honest, up to 1979, the bright trim was retained on 911s all the way through to the end of 1979. The black pack, which is what became the standard choice by 79, you could still option the bright work, which would be the beadwork, you know, around the windows, the hoop itself, and you know, certain other aspects on the car, the likes of the handles, I mean the door handles and so on. In 77, that's the only option that you had. So the cars would carry their bright work. And it's interesting how the bright work has such a distinctive impact on these cars appearing more classic to the eye. Once we get past 1980, effectively we're taking a bit of creative license to keep the bright work. It wasn't an option which you could get at the time, but within the broader realms of what I like to call OEM Plus, it is an option which we provide clients. So the bottom line on that is that aesthetically, I just find that the Targas really come alive when you start to optimize the combination of both texture and color. And just to give you an idea here, and we'll open up this for an idea. You've got this kind of beautiful combination between brushed aluminium, or brushed steel, sorry, brushed stainless steel. You've got these greys, you've got a tan leather, and then over here we've got a Dobby hood, which is in fact not that vinyl elephant hide original which Porsche do offer in their cars. I tend to steer away from that, and often we in fact even play with the color of hoods to make these cars even more distinctive, and we were able to source some very interesting hood fabrics from Europe for that purpose. But ultimately there's a lovely combination one can create from a car that is not in fact that old in true kind of vintage car terms. You've got a lot of plastic wear, everything else is fundamentally original as to what it should be in this car. But we're able to have a little bit of, not fun, but we can get these cars to look really quite wonderful by mixing and playing with those colors. This car over here is, I think, a very good example of that too. It's in fact an identical leather color. Same thing, you've got a stainless steel hoop. You've got these beautiful details which we retain. This car also happens to have a radio or a headset which is then linked to some fairly powerful sound, one of the requests from the client. But ultimately the combination of texture and color, bright work, aluminium versus plastic work, etc., really leads one to be able to kind of make these cars really quite interesting. And the point that I wanted to make was, instead of trying to change everything, rather just make everything perfect. Every stitch is perfect, every bolt is perfect, every, I don't know, intersection of one material to the other is perfect. And what you then get is this kind of package which becomes in its own right remarkable without trying to break a rule. It is in fact a lot more difficult to make something perfect without breaking the rules than just trying to make something different and then people don't understand which rules you're trying to adhere to, in my opinion. So that's why we use this term simple is hard, making these cars simple and amazing at the same time. All right, we've driven that car to talk about its performance. Let's rather talk about this car's performance and show you its motor. So what we've got here in the back, 2.7 litre motor, also high compression, and carries the original Bosch injection or CIS system, got the original 5-blade fan, but everything in the car, everything is 100% perfect the way that it should be. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of investment, but when you get them and you make them right, they are quite remarkable. And as a result, my view is that there's really nothing that I think can be said negatively about a Targa in the context of kind of today's, let's call it, driving experience.
The only other thing that I will say is, and this is a personal observation, and I'm totally objective in this because I am in the unfortunate position where I in fact personally do not own a Targa. But when I test drive these cars, one of the very good perks of this job, when I test drive a Targa, obviously done the way that we do them I think helps, but the feedback that I get from people, from guys which are hedge fund traders, from people who help me pump gas, from, I don't know, even the police who stop me to check my license accreditation, it is always a positive response. It is never filled with, I don't know, that kind of slight sneer that one gets when you drive a contemporary, let's call it collector car. You're just some rich beep who has more money than he knows what to do with. Never has any of that connotation to it. Kids love them. Kids, for some reason, and these are obviously people that have grown up in an age where these cars weren't on the road. And the number of times they see these cars on the road is on the very rare occasion, but it's just instant face lights up. Hey, that is something special. And you do certainly get that with the coupes and some of the more exotic coupes, but there's something infinitely likable about these cars that gives you something that you cannot get with the others.
So to wrap up, this video was not kind of designed to just in some way kind of, I don't know, convince people that the Targa is better than the coupe, or for that matter the cabriolet. Not the intention whatsoever. The intention was simply to, I think, draw attention to the fact that how one values a vehicle needs to consider or take into consideration the broader value propositions that are on offer. And I think a lot of people blindly follow the market without fully understanding what it is that they do or don't get in purchasing and owning one of these vehicles. A lot of people, I think, deal in conjecture, which is it's hearsay and what if scenarios without actually owning these vehicles. And in my view, there is such a massive value proposition that these cars have got to offer that they easily step right up to the value proposition that a coupe has to offer. And when the number that one pays, I don't know, to acquire one, to fix one, whatever the case may be, to do to them what we do, well, that's a separate point altogether. The market will kind of put that number in front of you, but my suggestion is that anybody who has the opportunity of buying one, owning one, take it. There's no question whatsoever. And if over the course of time the value of these Targas potentially even creeps up and beyond those of the coupes, then so be it. And I guess with that, the last thing to say is, if there is something about these Targas which makes them absolutely and utterly unique, it has got to be the fact that, well, I guess they're not a cabriolet and they're not a coupe. They are what they are. And in my opinion, they are extremely beautiful and something to be cherished. And thank you so much.